are listening to Talk for the Non-Talkers, an introvert's field guide to thriving in a world that often favors the loud. I am Sanjay Gopinath, your host. This show is produced by Indira Priyadashini, and together we explore how quiet minds can lead, connect, and show up powerfully without pretending to be someone they are not. In each episode, we bust myths around introversion, share practical tools, and talk to real introverts thriving in leadership, arts, entrepreneurship, parenting, and beyond. Let's get into today's conversation. Today's guest is someone who has spent her career helping people understand why they behave the way they do and how to break unhelpful patterns to reach their full potential. Dr. Sanna Balsari-Palsule is a psychologist, writer, and lecturer whose work blends insights from behavioral science, social psychology, and neuroscience. She holds a PhD from University of Cambridge and currently teaches at Ashoka University and Golden State University. Over the past decade, she has worked with United Nations, BBC, and other global organizations to design programs that enable human flourishing from habits and goals to well-being and decision-making. In this episode, we talk about what introversion really means, what the personality labels we are given often miss the mark, and how understanding ourselves more deeply can shape everything from work to relationships to how we show up in the world. Please welcome Dr. Sanna Balsari-Palsule. Okay, Dr. Sanna, thanks for joining us to this talk of the non-talkers. So first, to start with, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah. So your work actually bridges a lot of areas from social psychology to behavioral science and neuroscience, to say the least. What drew you to the study of personality and behavior?
So it's a bit of a kind of personal journey that I've had with this topic. I attended a lecture by a psychologist called Brian Little. He very openly talked about is a very naturally introverted person. And honestly, when I was listening to this lecture, this is 13, 14 years ago now, I was so struck by how extroverted he seemed, right, when he was delivering this lecture. This is someone who is actually extremely introverted, as he told us. And we then kind of discussed this whole personality is not a fixed entity, the way that we're kind of conditioned to believe it is. And that's what really got me interested in it, because in my own kind of personal life, I am an academic, I teach as part of my role. And I've noticed that, I do have to have this push and pull where, yes, I am more naturally introverted, but when I enter a classroom, when I'm, and I teach kind of predominantly kind of executive MBAs, and there are all these stereotypes, of course, about kind of MBA students and the alpha kind of nature of them. I can't be my natural introverted self all the time. I have to flex that extroversion. I have to be more extroverted. So that's really what got me interested in this whole kind of notion of the malleability of our personality and the effort that it takes, but also the rewards as well as the consequences.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sanna. And that was very interesting to talk about the malleability of the character. And we'll talk about that more later. So I just want to kind of set the ground, because we are talking to many people who are introverted from multiple fields in life. So to start with, I just want to set the ground in terms of what's the definition for an extrovert and an introvert. And why I'm asking this question is because there are a lot of wrong notions or not so clear notions about these two particular words. So it'll be good for the benefit of myself and as well as the listeners to get that straight of what do you mean by an extrovert, what do you mean by an introvert.
I'm so glad you're starting with this, because you're absolutely right. There are so many misconceptions around specifically introversion and extroversion. So I guess before I get to the definition, I will just debunk kind of one of the biggest myths around introversion, which is that introversion is shyness. And, we typically think that an introvert is someone who doesn't like to socialize, is shy, is withdrawn. And that's a bit of a kind of stereotype. An introvert can be shy, yes, but shyness is from a psychological standpoint, it's a completely separate construct. And what you find in kind of studies of personality science is that introverts are not necessarily kind of averse to socializing than extroverts. A way that I would understand kind of a better way to understand kind of introversion and extroversion is in terms of kind of energy and stimulation. So an introvert will find a social situation with a number of people, let's say a networking event or kind of a big kind of gathering, can enjoy that, but will find themselves overstimulated quite quickly. An extrovert will actually derive energy from that situation, whereas an introvert maybe can kind of do one thing, but then needs that time and that space to recharge by themselves or with a partner or with a friend or doing an activity. So it really comes down to that energy and that recharge kind of aspect.
Yeah, fantastic. And I can relate to it perfectly well. See, if somebody sees me at a workplace, they will not think that I'm an introvert. But I know, like, for family members know that I'm an introvert, and I can see that I can also socialize. But after some time, I need my space to kind of recharge. So it's very good, and good that we start from that. So my next question, which is leading from what you told, is that a binary trait? And I remember Dr. Sanna, and full disclosure that I was Dr. Sanna's student at one of the executive programs. So she talked about this term at that point of time called pseudo extrovert, and which I could like perfectly relate with. So maybe if you can take us through, is this a binary trait or what is a pseudo extrovert? And I've heard this term called ambivert. So if you can throw some light around what this is and probably touch on that malleability of the character you talked about, it'll be great.
Of course. Yeah, so this is another big, we've covered one misconception, that introversion is not shyness. The second misconception is that these are binary kind of traits, whereas actually the introversion kind of extroversion personality trait is on a spectrum. So you can move from extremely introverted to extremely extroverted. You could be somewhere in the middle, which is an ambivert. So an ambivert is someone who kind of blends introverted and kind of extroverted traits. And that's why kind of when we're looking at the malleability of introversion and extroversion, you might be naturally very introverted, but in a, let's say that in a kind of organizational context, you have a leadership role or a managerial role. You might be kind of, whilst you might be on the extreme on the spectrum, you might be kind of pushing your extroversion a little bit, right? Adopting traits of an extrovert. And that's what we would call pseudo extroversion in this case. At the same time, you could also be highly extroverted or somewhat extroverted. And, this is something that we can actually talk about because the pandemic was a great example of a time when, extroverts suddenly they were forced to be introverted. And they were kind of adopting pseudo introversion in those kind of settings and examples. So I guess the main thing that I would want to kind of reiterate is that it's a spectrum. It is not as binary and categorical as we think it is. We do like labels, and the Myers-Briggs is something that a lot of people use from a scientific, I think if you might remember this from one of the lectures, from a scientific standpoint, the Myers-Briggs is not scientifically valid or reliable. But we have to try and understand, why is it that we gravitate towards it? And it's because we like to be able to categorize ourselves and understand ourselves in these labels. The problem is that we misunderstand them. And I think introversion and extroversion is a good example of that.
All right, great. I mean, that's really good to hear. And I still remember when you were relating to that pseudo extrovert example. I mean, how I could easily relate to that is, see, in the office, I have to, and I'm a manager, I have teams to work with. And if I stay introverted in the office, of course, it's just not affecting me alone, but it is also affecting my team members to gain that visibility, to work across, collaborate across and all. But when I take the car back from office to home, that is when I kind of switch off to my introvert mode. And and you touched on the pandemic. Pandemic is a time when I picked up running quite seriously. And of course, a lot of people took running, cycling, and all those kind of sports. And then there were groups formed. And then there were some of my friends said, "Hey, Sanjay, why don't you just come and join our group. And I said, no, 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 that's a time when I need to be myself. I need to recharge myself. And I like really relish that time of being with myself because I know that I have to take the character, a different character in some other place, maybe in a few hours. So I can completely relate to that. So have you seen people changing? You talked about spectrum. So have you seen people changing from one side of the spectrum to another side of the spectrum completely? What has genetics got to play with this? Is there something that genetics has got to do with it? Maybe you can throw some light from your research and studies.
Absolutely. Before I do that, I would love to just touch upon what you mentioned about the running and the running
Yeah,
club, because
yeah,
there was a study that I conducted a few years ago where I examined employees and how they kind of flex, their introversion and their extroversion at work, and what are the activities that they engage in to recharge.
okay,
And we call this in psychology, we call these restorative niches. This is the work of Brian Little. And these restorative niches are very specific personality based forms of restoration. So as an introvert, running alone is going to be your form of restoration. But for an
right,
extrovert, it might be that socializing can actually recharge you. So the idea is that there are differences across personality traits. And the why I wanted to mention the running and running club is that when I did this study, I asked introverts and extroverts how they kind of recharge, and running was kind of listed across the board for a number of employees. And I was quite puzzled initially because typically you expect different forms of restoration across different personality traits. And it was only when I probed that I found that the extroverts were part of a running club and the introverts were running alone.
yeah,
Right. So I think your example is exactly captures that exact kind of sentiment, right? Where it's an experience where for you, running alone was your form of lowering your stimulation and just getting back to your natural self. But for
right,
an extrovert, a running club is a way of socializing, and you're getting a lot from the energy of other people, and that's restorative.
yeah,
Right? So
yeah,
I
yeah.
find that really interesting.
Yeah, perfect. And the question about has genetics got something to do with it? Do people change over a time? Maybe like a huge life incident or something. Have you seen situations like that?
So in terms of the change, personality is relatively fixed, right? I
Okay.
think that's important for your listeners to kind of know that it is relatively fixed. It's not that we can just kind of decide one day, wake up one day and decide, oh, I want to be an extrovert, right?
Yeah.
It's very, very difficult.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of effort because these are partly inherited traits. So there is a
Okay.
genetic component. Psychologists don't have a definitive answer on how, I can't say that it's 30% inherited genetic versus 50%. So we don't have a specific kind of percentage of this, but we do know that there is some level of inherited kind of inheritance of these traits. So it's not that we can just kind of, uh, change overnight.
Right.
However, that being said, we can change. Personality is, yes, it is relatively fixed, but in the same way that we can adopt a new habit, right? Or we can learn a new skill with effort, with time, we can change kind of aspects of our personality. So an introvert or an extrovert, right, who finds that in their role, and I think post-pandemic, we're seeing more of what I call the rise of the ambivert leader, where, we need leaders to be both extroverted, but also imbibe the wonderful qualities of introverts, which are, listening more intently, being kind of more cautious, less risk kind of taking, being able to recognize the contribution of everyone in a team. So I think we're seeing the rise of that ambivert leader, and there are ways to adopt the traits to make it kind of a practice essentially, and be able to kind of shift one's personality. It is very effortful, and that's what I want to kind of reiterate, that it is
Yeah.
not, I don't want to kind of make it sound like because if everyone wanted to change their personality, we would do that. It does take effort, but what we know from psychological research now is that it is possible with the
Okay.
right kind of strategies.
Okay, all right. Yeah, probably we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the next section, which is talking about workplace introversion and extroversion. And most of our listeners are corporate folks working as professionals or running companies or working in startups, academic institutions. And I generally feel, and probably it's coming from me as an introvert, is that the corporate world, especially when it's getting multicultural, when the offices are spread across different parts of the world, I have to interact with my counterparts in multiple regions of the world, where again, I guess the culture probably has some sway on how they behave. The corporate demands these employees to be more and more extroverted, especially when the companies become larger and larger. So in that word, where I say the extroverted on corporate world, I just want to go deeper and then lean on to some of your experience to get our listeners learn some tips, tricks. I mean, both sides, introverts and extroverts. So that's our next section. So is there some jobs in the corporate world or from your research which you have found out that hey, these are good for extroverts or these are good for introverts? And why I'm asking you is that, see, as a manager for long years in my life, I also hire people. So sometimes I've heard some of my colleagues saying that, hey, that guy seemed very introverted. So is that the person right for sales? So some of these things, and again, you talked about busting some myths, right? So can you throw some light about, hey, are there some jobs kind of reserved, should be reserved for introverts, like research and development looks like that is the sweet spot for introverts. Sales, sweet spot for extroverts. Is there something like that? Or are these also some kind of myths?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because this is something that I talk a lot about, in that there is this myth that there is personality job fit, right? That there are certain personalities that are going to be better suited to certain roles, to certain jobs. Now, that may be the case. It might be that you are someone who is, because we're talking about introversion and extroversion, who is more introverted, and therefore you are going to find a role that involves less kind of leadership and managerial kind of responsibilities. You're going to find that more suitable for you. You're going to flourish in that role. So I accept that is, one side of things. My issue with this is that with this kind of thinking, what we are ignoring is that, going back to what I started with, there is a malleability in personality. You can be an introvert who is in a leadership role, and you can be absolutely wonderful at your job, and you could even be better at your job than a natural extrovert, because you're able to kind of bring in aspects of your natural introversion, but you also are kind of bringing in or acting in extroverted ways. And what I don't like about the personality job kind of categorization, when we think through that lens of fitting people in to roles because of their personality, is that we don't leave room for that. We don't leave room for the fact that we can change, and we can act in ways that may not feel natural to ourselves, but that fit the role that we're in, and that we can flourish with that.
Yeah, okay. That's good. That's good. So again, leaning into some of my corporate experience, one of the feedbacks I got very early in my life, and this is when I was working with a larger company, is that, oh, Sanjay, you should speak up in some of these meetings. Now, I have written a little bit about that much later, because that time I didn't know how to do that. And since I get that, because if I'm going to lead teams, if I'm a leader, I mean, I have to influence people. So probably there are some kind of share of voice which I need to get in the room. But it becomes difficult for an introvert. And especially when there are 20, 25 people in the room, virtual, some people are virtual, some people are in person, there are senior folks and all those, there are multiple cultures. And I've seen this not just with the people from India, but also with some of the East Asian countries where they also struggle. So now, my question to you is, do you have some ways in which like people can work through this? If I'm an introvert, where do I get started? It may be really helpful because I've heard it from people who are very junior coming into the organization and getting this advice, but there is no actually practical tip on how to do that. How to do that? Like I cannot speak up. Okay, yeah, I have points, but I can speak up. So, have you seen people kind of getting over these kinds of challenges in their corporate life, and how do they do that? Or maybe some starting points.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up this example because this is one of the most common experiences of people who are more introverted in corporate environments where they do need to speak up in a session. And as you said, like when it's a big group of people, and this is what's interesting about it, is often due to size as well. I think
Yeah.
that, if an introvert's in a group of three people,
Yep.
they're going to feel a lot more comfortable
Yeah.
kind of speaking up and maybe being spontaneous. But it is also dependent on the size of the group. Before I go into kind of tips around this, I do want to say that I think one thing that we tend to do is that we put a lot of the onus on introverts, right?
Mm.
Like, what should an introvert do to make their presence known?
Yeah.
But often it's also about the culture of an organization and leadership, where there should be ideally a recognition that there are different personalities in a room, and not everyone is comfortable just kind of spitballing in a very spontaneous way. And we should be thinking about how to actually change the practices or tweak the practices of the way that we conduct meetings where people feel comfortable to speak up in a very kind of I guess safe space.
Yeah.
And so that I think is not on introverts. That is also on the more extroverted colleagues or leaders or team members who are able to kind of understand that it is not easy for an introvert to just start speaking kind of ex tempo. So that's one kind of thing I want to just raise, that I think there is an onus and a responsibility of organizations to recognize this. In terms of actual kind of strategies, as I said, it is a very common experience. Typically, I keep going back to this idea of a habit because I think it's one of those things that it needs to be practiced. It can be, to go from not speaking up to suddenly kind of standing up in a meeting of 20 people. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
But if a person can basically practice this kind of in smaller ways over time, you can then build up the confidence to be able to do that in a setting like this. But the practice element is really important. And again, having that safe space to do that is so important.
Yeah.
Ideally, we want to be, organizations should be a place where these things are discussable, where we recognize that there are strengths and growth areas for every personality trait. But unfortunately, that's not the case. So, it does require a little bit of that practice to get to a point where you feel a lot more confident. And, I speak to a lot of people about this. For many, it still feels quite physiologically quite a lot when, they stand up and they do this. But
Yeah.
they're so used to doing it that even though that they still have that initial kind of feeling, they know that it's going to, they know what they're doing because they've done it so many times before. So I think that would be kind of one of the strategies I would recommend.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you touched on the right point of habit. It's not that you can change like a flip of a coin, you change your character overnight. But I think there are some things which you can do over a period of time, which like I've been doing. So one of uh, my kind of tips and tricks, especially for networking. And since I'm an introvert, I find it really difficult to go and network. But my job demands that I'm in sales marketing. So you need to go and meet with people, talk to people, and completely unknown people. So now what I did at some point in my career, because I was finding it really difficult, was to research some people who used to come for that event. So you know that there are like 20, 25, 50 people coming. So I know there are a few people coming. Just research them based on LinkedIn or something. And then earlier my target was how can I meet more people? But then I removed that. Okay, that's not possible for me. But can I talk to like three people and then do some research and I do some research in terms of like where have they studied, probably what do they like, may not be very related to their business or work. Of course, that comes later. But then kind of try to start the conversation around some of those. And sometimes, or rather many times, I find that people are more interested in talking that, especially in a very casual environment, than talking probably, okay, what is the work you do? So, and that started working for me and it became a habit now. So I do my homework and I go. Even if I'm meeting like one person, I do that homework and go. So that has worked for me. So the habit, what one you mentioned is very right. I also want to go to the other side. You talked about why the leaders should be more inclusive in understanding this. So, have you found leaders getting more and more sensitized with this concept that there are probably a lot of people who are introverts in my team, and maybe some tips to the leaders because some of the leaders could be extroverted. How do they help give that safe space? And you talked about that. You save space to their introverted team members to voice their opinion.
Yeah, to your first question on whether I'm seeing a change, yes and no.
Mhm.
I think in the last 10 years, there has been more of an awareness of the kind of power of introversion. There have been a number of notable books and TED Talks and podcasts. So I do think we have seen a cultural shift where we're recognizing diversity in personality and the strengths that other personalities kind of bring, especially in corporate environments that typically favor the extroverted kind of personality trait. So I do think we're seeing that shift. At the same time, are we seeing it in practice? Not always. I think we've made that theoretical kind of jump, but I'm not sure that we're seeing our work environments, particularly in industries that are traditionally, very kind of extroverted or value kind of extroversion. Are we seeing that in practice enough? I don't think so. Saying that, I recently ran a kind of a workshop for a big five kind of consultancy, and we had 500 employees join around the world on Zoom, and they essentially kind of have started this working group for introverts,
Okay.
and it's so they do a once a month they bring on a speaker or they do a session, and it's a very traditional strategy kind of consultancy. And I was so pleasantly surprised to firstly have that. I mean, I wasn't surprised to have that level of participation because we know that this is a challenge in our organization.
Right.
But what I loved about the way that the session was conducted is I was there, as a psychologist, kind of bringing in the research. But alongside me was a partner from one of their offices who talked about being an introvert, but the way that they have to kind of flex and be more extroverted because of the culture, but also the strategies that they employ in order to kind of manage this push and pull on their personality. And I think that's really helpful. I think there needs to be a role modeling. Leaders need to role model what it's like to sometimes have to be different to their natural selves because of the role, because of being kind of in those leadership kind of positions, and just make other people feel seen and feel heard. And that's one way of kind of at least initiating that safe space for employees, because otherwise I think it's quite difficult in these organizations for employees who are more introverted to feel that they will succeed, because they don't see that their kind of seemingly extroverted manager is actually quite introverted and is just kind of not putting this on, but is flexing that.
Yeah.
They don't see that. So I think it's really important to make this discussable and also to remove the stigma of it. Why should there be stigma that you are naturally more introverted or more of an ambivert or naturally more extroverted?
Yeah. Yeah, that's very nice. And one Few takeaways from what you said is one, organizers should do more in terms of inclusivity, and probably the awareness is getting better, but the actions probably can be louder. And I also like that Big Five experience, which you told that companies are doing some steps. So I'm sure that this people who are at the right positions in companies should take some steps there. And I love that part about role modeling of the manager. And I think lately I've been doing that to even say that, hey, I'm an introvert, and I can understand other people in the group who are having probably more towards that introversion spectrum, and trying to help them. Hey, I'm an introvert, but I do this. So I think that role modeling also helps. So beautiful tips out there. And I want to poke a little bit further on what you told earlier, that you talked about, if I'm not mistaken, the rise of the ambiverted leader. So can you talk a little bit more about that? How do leaders who probably are extroverted or are introverted, how do they bring the best of both worlds to get best out of their teams and for their own benefit and for their companies?
Sure, sure. So I think to delve into this deep, I'd like to just start with an example from some research that was conducted in 2012 by Adam Grant on the ambivert advantage. And Adam Grant he and his kind of colleagues, they looked at individuals in employees in sales, in the sales kind of and marketing kind of profession, and they expected to see the highest performance for the extroverts, right, in those teams. And actually what they saw was the highest performance for ambiverts, not for introverts, not for extroverts, but for people who felt kind of in the middle. And I thought this was so interesting because one of the reasons why ambiverts were more successful, and these were kind of hard indicators, right? It was sales revenue was
Yeah.
the indicator of their success, was that they were blending the assertive kind of aspects of an extrovert. So they were persuasive, they were assertive, but they were also bringing in the strengths of introverts, where they were listening to their clients, to their customers, and they were bringing in that element as well. And so that blend was the most successful. And I think, to your question on the ambivert leader, I think given that we are, seeing this shift towards recognizing the strengths of introverts, there are also strengths in extroverts. Being assertive is a strength of an extrovert. Being able to take quick decisions in certain situations is very important. What the ambivert kind of represents is an agility, is an ability to be adaptive to a certain situation or to a context. So in the case of the pandemic, leaders needed to be firm and guide their employees, but they also had to be empathetic, because we were all going through something that we'd never experienced before. Yeah. And there was a huge amount of emotional turmoil that people were facing. And so leaders had to bring in both kind of aspects of this introversion extroversion spectrum. And I think the starting point the starting point is just to recognize that. Unfortunately, we still, and that's why it's great that we're doing a podcast. You're doing a podcast like this with this as a topic, because there's still not enough of it. We're scratching the surface, and I think that the first step to changing the way that we do things is just building an understanding and an awareness. We all kind of bring individual strengths to the table. And in order to be adaptive, in order to be a really good leader, we have to be aware of the importance of flexing between these. And an ambivert represents, I think I see it more as a representation of that adaptiveness, of that ability to recognize the strengths of an introvert, to recognize that, a person is going to find it difficult to speak up kind of spontaneously, is going to need time to prepare before that. Okay. And then we'll bring wonderful ideas, but they need that time. In the same, I think it's really important to recognize these things.
Yeah, so Sanna, we traversed quite a large number of topics today. You started with defining what's introversion, extroversion. You clearly defined that it's not binary. We probably are the spectrum somewhere. And also, we talked about some tips and some actions and the importance of making that a habit for introverts specifically to get into that extroverted activities, at least in your corporate life. And the need for corporates to first be aware and then recognize, realize, and take actions to make it more an inclusive workplace. And it's very important that when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, somewhere I feel this part of introversion and extroversion is not coming into that inclusion. So hopefully, people who are listening in could start something at their own office. So before we close that, I would also like to get some things which you want the introverts and extroverts listening into this podcast to take away beyond what we have talked about, and maybe some of your own personal strategies or something they can read or listen to that may be of help.
Absolutely. So what's great about the cultural shift is that there are many more resources available that talk about kind of this very similar topics to what we've spoken about today. There's a book by Susan Cain for the more introverted listeners out there. There's a book by Susan Cain, Quiet. There's also a TED Talk where she talks about the power of introverts, challenges that introverts face in their organizations. I think we've covered a lot in the last kind of 45 minutes, but I do feel like I just want to kind of reiterate that I think that we are moving, and I'm very happy about this shift and the fact that we are discussing this, right? I think we are moving towards a place that is celebrating difference, is celebrating the strengths of different personality traits. I feel that I'm being brought in to do a lot more work around this. So I think there is a growing awareness of it.
Great.
But how do we actually do that in practice? How do we starting with removing the bias that we have towards extroverts? That to me is the starting point. Being an extrovert does not mean you are going to be more successful, right? It is not some blanket kind of rule. It might be in a certain role that an extrovert does flourish, but that might be due to something other than their extroversion as well.
Right.
And I think it's so important to remove those biases that we have. There is no stigma to being an introvert, an extrovert, an ambivert. I also think it's about finding one's own individual ways and strategies of dealing with this, right? You talked about your strategies at a networking event, and that works really well for you.
Yep.
That strategy may not work for everyone, and there's this research on goals and kind of goal effectiveness from Wharton. It's called kind of the phenomenon is copy paste prompts. So the idea that we are better equipped to pursue our goals when we copy and paste strategies from our peers.
Okay.
And I think we could apply that here as well. I think instead of doing this in a siloed way, instead of battling, some of these challenges alone, can we create an awareness and openness and inclusivity to discussing the strategies that we use? And going back to the example I gave of this workshop I did for 500 employees, what was wonderful is that people were so active on the chat, sharing their experiences, sharing how they kind of managed sometimes the challenge of kind of moving between kind of personality in their roles. And it became a community for that. So can we build that for individuals, first by removing the stigma and then actively kind of bringing people together?
I mean, that's a great note, Sanna, that can we build a community of introverts, probably start in your own organization to give that safe environment for them to share. And also, like you talked earlier, can some of the leaders who have been successfully maneuvering this space share their experiences so that others can copy and paste that strategy and probably fine tune as they go further and then make it a habit. So Thank you, Dr. Sana, for spending this time. And I'm really happy to bring you to our podcast here, having spent some time with you at my executive program with you. And that was actually an eye opener for me, specifically to understand these two, introversion, extroversion. And I think that gave me a lot more of confidence to expose some of my vulnerabilities to my team members and then share some of my experiences publicly as well as in small spaces. So I really love the conversation. And I hope that the listeners also would pick a few things out of this, be it an introverted listener or an extroverted listener, and then apply that in their own spaces, corporate spaces, and their personal life. So thank you again. And yeah, thanks. And probably hope to talk to you soon later. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning into Talk for the Non-Talkers, where quiet minds speak loud truths. If today's conversation resonated, share it with someone, introvert or extrovert, who will appreciate it. Follow the show on Spotify or YouTube and leave a review. This will help more people discover the podcast. This is Sanjay with Indira signing off. Until next time, keep showing up quietly but powerfully.